Hello. Today we will be discussing Mary Shelley and her novel, The Last Man. We will also be discussing scholar Gary Kelly and his journal article, The Last Man and Masculine History. Gary Kelly's ultimate argument as we dive into this is that Mary Shelley takes the influence of the French Revolution and the way that it changed French society and uses it to show how humanity can come together and rewrite and re-edit history so that it is not as male-centric and male-focused as it already is, but rather is leveled and is made even so that male and female voices can be heard and male and female champions of history are known. In order to discuss the impact that The Last Man can have on the future, we have to go back to the past. Specifically, we have to go back to the French Revolution and the impact on Britain. Now, Gary Kelly begins his article by discussing male polemicists. A polemist is a person who is constantly and actively engaged in discussing and debating controversial and hot-button issues. Now, these male polemicists constantly debated the effects that the French Revolution might have on Britain. Now, we see in chapter 2 of The Last Man that the English king has been dethroned and a republic has been formed. Well, again, this comes on the heels of the French Revolution. This is related back to the French Revolution, in which the French monarchy is dethroned, torn down, and a French republic is instead put in place. And so what Gary Kelly is asserting is that Mary Shelley took the influence of the French Revolution and took the discussion of the male polemicists who were debating how Britain would respond to such a revolution in France, and works to see what happens if England decides to take a page from France and get rid of the king and form a republic. Now, as Gary Kelly discusses, various movements subsumed reformist impulses of the late 18th century. What Kelly is saying here is that these impulses that he's referring to, these reformed impulses, affected change regarding gender, societal dynamics, and even national identity. When a country's government completely changes from one style of leadership and of government to another, everything in society is affected like a ripple effect. The economy changes, the way people interact with one another changes, the way that people see themselves change. If we go back to the Roman Empire, it was a privilege to be considered a Roman. You were a Roman before all else. Now we as readers see this very identity crisis affect the ex-Queen of England, who is now the Countess of England, but she cannot come to grips with the fact that she is no longer a queen, and in fact, she urges her son Aidan all throughout his childhood, all throughout his life, to ultimately take back the throne of England, reestablish an English monarchy so that she can gain her place back as an English royal more than just a countess. Now, let's discuss what this means, what the French Revolution means for women. Women had largely been ignored pre- and post-revolution, the French Revolution. Therefore, many women who had previously had fairly easy lifestyles or at least constant lifestyles in the pre-French Revolution now have to turn to new ways to survive. Many of these women took to writing, and through that, played a major force in shaping the new French culture. Society is, by all means, shaped by the literature that we read and that we put out. As Gary Kelly notes, history up to the present had been characterized by masculine activities of conflict, violence, destruction, and by states that operated by exercise of main force on its subjects and on other states. And we see this throughout history and literature. We see this in religion, we see it through historical texts. For instance, in the American Revolution, American students are taught about George Washington, and we're taught how George Washington sailed across the Delaware and united the American armies and fought off the British Empire. If there are discussions of women, it's typically that George's wife, Martha, sewed together the first American flag. And then we're right back to hearing about George Washington and Paul Revere, but we're not very often introduced to somebody like Sybil Ludington, who many people refer to as the female Paul Revere. Now, the reason why is because Sybil Ludington was a 16-year-old girl who also had a midnight ride. In fact, her ride was longer than Paul Revere's, as she went to warn the New Yorkers that the British were coming. Now, even if people are taught who Sybil Ludington is, the fact that history is so dominated by men and the male perspective shows even when we're trying to introduce more women into historical discourse. For instance, even I, just a few moments ago, referred to Sybil Ludington as the female Paul Revere in an effort to kind of scaffold or bridge the gap of connecting this one person who is a male to another person who is a female, but that many people have not heard of. Now, what does this mean for history? Well, this feminized history would include everything that male history would leave out, the Sybil Ludingtons of the world. The most common medium for women to express feminism and feminist history was through fiction. Most of these women writers who took up writing post-French Revolution were only able to get their voices heard through fiction and through these made-up stories. Now, the benefit is humanity loves a good story. Humanity loves fiction. And so while their mediums were limited, while women weren't able to write on a huge scope of genres and have their works taken seriously, they were able to target the most popular and the most influential, which was fiction writing. Now, in Gary Kelly's words, Mary Shelley was a leading exponent of feminized history. And what he's saying is that of Shelley's 4 novels that deal with challenging and engaging in masculine history, The Last Man is, according to Kelly, Mary Shelley's most complex work, in that Mary Shelley uses The Last Man to take on the traditional male role and the traditional male history and just so slightly, ever so subtly, spin it on its head. Mary Shelley's work is an analogous reframing of what happened in England as it went from a commonwealth to a restored court monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. These changes in governments happened in cycles. And according to Kelly, the similar but fictitious future cycle in Shelley's novel, this idea of going from a monarchy to a republic, just as England has gone from a republic back to a constitutional monarchy to the monarchy that we know of today, the constitutional monarchy, the similar but fictitious future cycle in Shelley's novel marginalizes the feminine, intrudes on the subjective and domestic spheres, and proves futile, just as readers would suppose that the earlier and contemporary cycles had done. What Gary Kelly is saying is that Mary Shelley's implication is that when history is cyclical, which it often is, the current goings-on become futile and ultimately meaningless. What Shelley is saying here in her novel, through her novel, is that, sure, England went from a monarchy to a republic, but it's something that's been done before, and what's ultimately changed from this? Nothing. Very little. So what does this mean for the future? And where does the plague come into all of this? Well, the mass death of the plague defies the optimism of human revolution in any form. What we mean by human revolution, what Gary Kelly means by human revolution, is that societal revolutions, industrial revolutions, any kind of change in humanity that makes substantial forward progress is ultimately undone by the plague. The plague destroys the man-made, leaving only the human, the primal, the instinctual. What does this mean for the last man? Who the last man is? Verney, according to Kelly, is a feminized male, and he is left alone in the world, off to find a slim hope to rebuild the world in a much more balanced, level scope. Now, that is Gary Kelly's final argument. What I have gleaned from Kelly's argument and from The Last Man is that Verney is the new biblical Adam, the one male in need of one female in order to rebuild the world and start anew. In some ways, the last man is now the first man. Now, there are some biblical scholars that look at Adam and in their understanding of the Genesis story, the creation story, they see Adam as this person who, again, not just being the first human, but for a time being the only human, had 100% male traits and male DNA, and also had 100% female traits and female DNA. And if you look at the creation story, God takes a rib from Adam and forms Eve from it. And so these biblical scholars are concluding that God took that feminist quality in Adam through the rib to create Eve. Now, Mary Shelley was a religious woman, and so she would have been familiar with the creation story. If Verney is the new Adam, then he has all of the masculine traits and all of the feminine traits, and as he goes on to look for his new Eve, he's not just the last man, but in many ways, Adam and Verney are alike in that they are the first men.